We are pleased to introduce tonight's reader. Ruth Moritz is a writer, an installation and graphic artist, and a retired educator. She received an MFA in creative writing from Wichita State University, where she was the 2009-2010 MFA Fellow in Poetry. Her poetry has received an AWP Intro Journals Award, a Ploughshares New Voice Award, an Academy of American Poets Prize, a Holt Prize in Literature, and her essays have received the Isotope Prize for Creative Nonfiction and the Hunger Mountain Creative Nonfiction Prize. Moritz's poetry has appeared in Ploughshares, Puerto del Sol, and Mason's Road, among others, and poetic texts have become part of her public visual art installations. She was director of the Salina Spring Poetry Reading Series for 17 years and taught at the Ellsworth Correctional Facility, Kansas State University, and Kansas Wesleyan.
Good evening, all of you out there in virtual land. This will take a little bit of getting used to for me and probably for most of you as well. But I'd like to start off this evening by thanking Brad Anderson at Salina and Arts and Humanities, and also to Lori Brock for coordinating the readings this year, and to Anna Ploughshare-Morowitz for her part in facilitating the smooth running of all parts of the series. And then also to Feely Creative, even though I am not one who likes being in front of a camera, they are the ones that are making the series possible this year, so thank you very much. I guess overall I feel a bit like an interloper here tonight. After 17 different seasons of running the Salina Poetry Series myself, I've always felt that I was more comfortable being a director of a series or the editor of literary work or even a teacher of process than I am as a public poet or writer of my own accord. Contrary to everyone else in the series this year, I do not, as a rule, send my work out. I have written all of my life, but it's more the enjoyment of the process and the actual creation of the work is what is important to me. And so this evening, even though I say I am reading from different collections in process, more than likely I will not do anything with those collections. And I know that may seem strange, but it's just the way that I've always done my poetry. And so with that loose idea in mind, tonight what I'd like to do is start off with reading some selections from two different manuscripts in process. The first one is called Camera Obscura. The second one is The Lover Dreams of Sleep. And then I will end by reading selected works from my MFA manuscript, which is a complete book-length collection of poems called Prodigal Light. So that gets us to the first grouping. I will read 4 from a work in progress called Camera Obscura. I have taken photographs all of my life, sometimes with very cheap little Instamatics on up to really nice digital cameras. And I'm not sure what it is about photography that has always captivated me. Maybe it's my memory of a mother who was always taking photographs from a Brownie Hawkeye camera, which were the old box cameras that you would look down into from the top. Many of you have probably seen them. And they were like a little room in a way, in my opinion. And then as I started studying the physics of cameras, the optics and the light, that metaphor of the camera being almost like a room or a box that you entered where this exchange happened motivates a lot of the poems in this series. And so I'd like to begin by reading the first one in that series called Prism. It takes the light and folds it, planed as Iceland spar, held hard and particular in the palm of a hand. In 1949, my mother squinted into a brownie hawkeye, the sun circling slowly, all her angles folded toward a center where she smiled, and in the camera, too, a hidden glow, while the light curled in, hard and crystalline, behind her eyes. The light through the window snags on me at times, running sharp fingers through my hair, sliding like a too bright sorrow between my breasts. That is the place you cannot see, where the sun pierces to and cannot break, falling back into its own bright arms as I reach toward the lens again and again. When I first began gathering these poems into a loosely organized manuscript, a lot of it had to do with a communication that I had with a friend of mine in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Some of you may have met him when he was a warehouse artist here at the Salina Art Center, Max Carlos Martinez. He died a year ago, but prior to that, we often talked about photography and exchanged photographs with each other. And again, that image of a camera being almost like a room, this poem references that. Max had a very difficult childhood, and the particular references in this poem are to a photograph of him with his mother when he was young. It's called Lens. Our looks find each other here, eyes pressing like the fingertips of a prisoner toward a lover, touching with a force that could shatter glass. Who conceived of a camera's room, its barred pinhole and thin pencil of rays disbanding en masse to cancel blackness from the dark? But black is not a color, and you have much to impart about infrequencies of light, vectors absorbed by walls, walls expanding in triplicate, quadruplicate. As our gazes intersect in this vestibule of sight, behind you I see a house, a lovely woman. Her smile curves, her arm is drawing you away from an aperture into which you could fall. But you have left the moment, looking away. Already, did you see everything overturned? A home collapsed, your mother flailing, that salvo of light saving nothing, not even yourself. This one is a more recent poem. I don't know if it's age, but I have entered the era of MRIs, and I'm sure that a lot of you in the audience have had to withstand that process. And while an MRI is not a photograph in the traditional sense of a word, actually it's an image that's created by magnetic fields and computer-generated radio waves. But yet when I'm in that torpedo-looking thing, it feels like I have entered the camera itself, and also it's an absolute torture chamber, as any of you who have ever had an MRI know. And so there was a period a year or so ago where I had to have about 3 of them over a period of a few months. And about the second time, I realized that someone with a vivid imagination is not good inside the machine. And I started having kind of almost flashbacks of all the torture chambers that I'd ever read about. So this is a short poem that mentions those things. MRI. Into the depression of my palm they placed, grenade-like, a rubber bulb. Press this, they said, if you want help, and slid me, ankles bound, into a dark tunnel where already other skeletons echoed my disassembly. Golgotha, Wounded Knee, Babi Yar, My Lai, Rwanda, Darfur, Abu Ghraib. Images of history's bone heaps piling up behind closed eyes. And then from everywhere, such a deep banging. Dirty baggage in a drum, alarm bells down each dark hall, overhead hammering of the very last nail. We are so very small. I finger the detonation device in the hollow of my hand, feel my breath realign. Beneath my skin, the ball of my leg tenses in the sling of my hip and refuses to scream. And the last one I'm going to read of the series with photographs is what would be called a persona poem. Many of you are familiar with the photographs of Dorothea Lange from the Depression era. And the one I reference here is called Woman of the High Plains, and it's an image of a woman slightly at an angle, and she's got one hand behind her neck and the other at her throat, and she's kind of looking into the distance. I've often thought that Dorothea Lange got the results that she did from a lot of her subjects in her photographs was because she herself was crippled from polio and could not walk on the ball of one foot. So somehow the photographer, there was this leveling distance between her and her subjects. But this particular woman in the photograph, Woman of the High Plains, I wrote it from her point of view, speaking to Dorothea Lange, because all of the people in the Depression era photographs, they would have had another life and another persona before that happened. In the poem, I reference a lot of wildflowers that are basically considered weeds that will spring up in parched earth where nothing else will grow. So they're almost like a litany in a few of these. Woman of the High Plains after Dorothea Lange. Can you possibly fathom the inequality in light? Your level eyes already suppose my lines, my hard edges cleave your frame. At first it was otherwise. My eyes were wide open to his, our bodies carving desire from drought, our ruined breath a pellet to spell upon. These fingers could fashion then what I wanted. Touch first, then hunger pushing in so hard they pled to fetch reprieve from such fever, spreading from spike tip to spur of yellow star and puncture vine like wild flame. Fingers not themselves, but more than themselves. Part of the box and the bone of the body, cupping urges so unskinned and full of rude storm that I blush now inside the hard stare of your lens, which only underscores the black and white of me. How this land fails to shelter hearts, how it fingerprints without rain. So here I am, jagged against the wide angle of your sky, arms crooked, one hand to forehead, one to neck, a muscular W spelling why? Why in the curved spiral of hope do we fall victim to snares of light, knotweed, snake root, Medusa head? Why at the end of each A do I lie on the sod of the floor and conjure only forecasts of loose strife, spurge, and bitter nightshade? In the unsettled focus of this endless space, I turn to that wavering line in the west where light swivels, a ragged scrap that dusts the edges of dirt and farewell. Okay, the next four poems that I will read are from a manuscript called The Lover Dreams of Sleep. The word lover has so many varied connotations. The connotation that it has for me in most of these poems is not necessarily of the lover we might think of in the traditional physical sense, but also lover as being the other side of the person that I am or the person that he is. And also, to me, the term lover exists in this sort of nebulous space where the persona is never fully realized. There's something fleeting about it. Whereas if you say a couple, there's something unified and together about it. But lover implies that there is as much absence as there is presence. And that is sort of the feel that runs through a lot of these poems. Some of them are more self-explanatory than others, and then others are very much part of a subconscious. The first one is Falling for the Lover. A canyon opens inside the escarpment of greater air, this chasm of no resistance, where even a feather plummets helpless in the grip of gravity's sleek trajectory. The O of my scream hangs peeled mid-air like a plum without skin. 100 times I will hit that bottom, dissolving into the collision of our bones, your touch a wound that finds my flesh. There is no airlift for my heart, no return to the summit where your look remained tenure to a moment. Only this free fall into oblivion, no salvation, no mass for the dead, not even a memory of one foot still tethered to an edge of your olive, still suspended in vermouth. The next one is titled Fugitive, and it speaks to that loneliness that sometimes exists even in presence. Fugitive. Last night I visited the continent of your ear. You did not hear my approach. The candle's stutter warped the way. I listened with no speech, my voice a landmine in the country of such silence. Last night I traced the skin's map, the braille of your pulse, the course and contour of your breathing. Each pore transformed into a lens. Sight became the fingers I searched you with. I could find no way out. Last night I mined desire's cave. I carried no canary to assuage the heart's fear. Trapped already inside that vein, I could not move. I prayed for the terrible fluttering in my palm's cup to still, yet so afraid it would. Destination has no room. It is a journey I tote inside that has no home. Studying now your body's chart, I know again that vacancy, the way tracing a scar relives the wound. The suitcase of my body lies open beside you, the light's shadow folded there. Over and over I undo your name, its button caught in the eyelet of my breath. Inside this fugitive moment, the night bird plumbs the dark for its song. Now, lest you think that lover poems might be sexy, I'm going to speak of one in the terms of math. There's something about math and science that's so targeted and real and unchangeable. So it seems almost a desecration to speak of love or emotions in the terminology of math, but yet sometimes that's the terms that I guess force some reality upon it. And this one is titled Doing the Math. When your absence subsumes presence, I must trust in the subtrahend to subtract yet leave a hole. How else can I bear it? this calculation of your leaving the shortest line between two ends and me marking one terminus. Your exit a single vector incising its hypotenuse of loss. Already less than, I am a fugitive remainder, a hollow point. I stand in the mess and chaos at the end of love and envy such inerrancy in numbers, the cold serenity, the tidy circumscription, even as I watch the lineated wings of the hawk shield the rabbit so beautifully as the precision of talons trisect the heart. I was telling Lori before the readings that very seldom do I write poems that I or anyone else would think are funny. And I'm not sure why it ends up being so. But this one that I'm going to read now might be as close to that just because of the moment that inspired it. I had begun this series of lover poems and was sitting in a restaurant out in the Hayes area, overhearing a couple of Volga German farmers behind me talk about turnbuckles and just, machinery things behind me. And that deep German brogue and all of those L's rolling out gave me the giggles. And because I tend to write any sort of thing with alliteration in mind, I immediately sat down and wrote this poem. It's probably one of the few instances in my life that a poem pretty much came out its first draft the way it stayed. And it's called Lover Begins with L. And I loaded it with as many words loaded with L's as I could find. And they reference everything from types of knots to machinery to terms having to do with flying. So lover begins with L. Your voice behind me idles on low, L's prehensile, as they lasso the anvil of my sleepy attention. Accumulator, grapple hook, language to bring a girl to her knees any God-given Sunday morning. Litany of cable and turnbuckle, torque of carpal and ulna. You ratchet those alveolar laterals beyond anybody's ability to withstand their coiled imperative, leveraging that tensile moment to whisper, slip knot, toggle switch. Tongue to clevis, there is no satiable, ever-loving alleluia to lift me from that, oh God, help me, I'm falling declivity, altimeter plummeting, throttle cut, oh, clove hitch, coupler joint, lover's knot. And then this is the last of the Lover series that I will read. And this stems from a moment of almost fear and anguish. I don't know if any of you have ever woke up in the middle of the night knowing that you have just heard your name called into a dark or empty, silent room. And I wrote this after such an experience. And there's a sense of panic that comes when your name is called. And in this instance, it was like I felt that I was being warned for me or I was being warned for someone else. And so it's titled, The Lover Calls Out. Was it I or was it you who gave death the slip last night? My name, uttered twice, hung pendulous, like the nub at the end of a pull chain one stumbles toward and claims, a saving light at the end of the corridor of sleep. Or was it your voice that failed, extending my name's one syllable prehensile through the blur? I turned to answer, yes, but the walls, the corners, the casement blotted with the riddled wash of the trees relinquish no echo of that summons. Did the urgency of your call alert me to the fading of my own next breath? Or did it mark the dissolution of your last? I could not tell. I panicked and called your name in return, but the room retracted its ears. I froze, trolling the depths of the darkness. Nothing. Disembodied, the voice is a drowning thing. I could feel it tread thin air, gulp too much silence to ever reach its answering call. Okay, the remainder of the poems that I will read, most of them are in the book-length manuscript that I completed at the end of my MFA. There are a few thrown in that if I were to ever decide to seek publication of this manuscript, that I might replace them with some of the newer ones. But I will start off with a few of them that reference my family. My family plays, and also the region that I grew up in, plays very heavily in most of my poetry, as do a lot of scientific references. But I guess one of the things that some of you may know or not know, I am the oldest of 10 children of a German Catholic family from a very small town in north central Kansas. And that has informed so much of the way I view the whole world. I've oftentimes thought that, there was way more magic than just being Catholic that contributed to the 10 kids in my family. And this particular poem is about my parents, and it's called Wine Saps. There are a few terms in here. In case you didn't know, a wine sap is an apple, but I reference a piano. I had a very brief piano career, and the nun that taught me, I have very small Germanic hands, and so she always wanted me to keep my knuckles out, which meant I had even less span than normally I would have. So there's reference to that, and then two terms in music, fortissimo, which means very loud and energetic, and then pianissimo, which is soft and low. Wine saps. I am breathing Rachmaninoff in the unheated room where they slept, my parents, the piano, the winter bushel of apples. Over the distance, Sister Cecilia is still whispering, "Keep your knuckles out." Rachmaninoff pleads, "Fortissimo." And Papa says, "Keep anything cold enough and it will never lose its edge." So I practiced, peeling through to the ivory heart of that music, which hummed nights when he touched her, the white insides of her thighs having around that darkened eye, his finger bringing the blush up to her skin, the rough rouge of his hands pressing lightly one past the other. The keys are mending so cleanly here in this air, that cloven distinction so perfectly tuned. Pianissimo, the stilled music, my sweet apple, their sighs. Before marrying Mom and having all of us children, my father was a minor league baseball player. It was a love of his. At that time, you could be in the minor leagues and play professionally and move around quite a bit. And then his father wanted to retire, and so Dad gave up his career and took over the family farm. And I've always wondered if he had regrets about that. But as a result of that, me being the oldest, he oftentimes would play catch with me. And to this day, it is one of my most treasured memories of sharing with my father. This is called The Long Slide Toward Home. Fielding the night sky, I catch it there like memory, then out of vision. This meteor arcing toward its afterlight, suspends like the baseball Dad tossed in the driveway as I strained to reach its falling. Every evening I anticipated him parting the picket fence for milking, pail in one hand, hard ball in the right. How it seemed I was frozen like a star in an outfield of gravel as I waited for that moment to break and the earth rotate beyond this story, which is his. Minor league play abrupted by the hardness of land and decision, which condensed to that clutch of a ball which he wound up to throw as the applause of an evening lowered toward the hills and the cows their milk in the darkening barn. As Mom in the kitchen hesitated over potatoes mounding in the bowl, as the next sun shifted in her womb, as the dog in the distant alfalfa decided it was just far enough to go. At last his body would lift and open, his hand release its grip, his fingers and legs their curve of attention, and the ball would hang for that final note, light snagging on windrows, nighthawks diving toward home, and finally, straining through the air with its bearable pain, it would smack into my palm, hard as love. This is a poem written for my maternal grandparents. My grandmother was the first graduate of the high school where I grew up, and the only female graduate. And my grandfather quit school to work the farm, which wasn't uncommon back then. But he always claimed that when he met Grandma, they got together because she winked at him after church. But she has never totally denied the claim, but neither has she agreed with it. So this is a poem called The Wink for my grandparents. He tells the story as it was back then, how it all began as he rocks. The curve of the hills arrested in his eyes, the limestone bedding deep within as pale and cool as skin awaiting its first touch of startled light. She fingers the lace of her veil, fragile as the milkweed moth, and only smiles, for she knows love when it comes is patient, even as the hearts of peonies, buried long winters in the earth, bloom all through the spring, their slow undress. He wonders if maybe it was the singular length of the harvest, pressing him the length of 3 Sundays after they met, which made her wink there at him after church, hot June and thunderheads. Perhaps she too had considered him, already entangled on Monday in the corner of her eye, as she hung sheets immaculate against the heat and wind of a boundless sky. Maybe it all begins that way, a tiny wink that is certain as sky meeting land. It's not the camera's measured blink or the voice's careful vowel, but a tiny cloistered center deep inside that opens and closes forever around its chosen eyeful of sight. The next poem is written in 4 parts. When I was a freshman in high school, my mother died of leukemia, and most of my adult life, I looked for the metaphor that would allow me to somehow write about that experience, which was sudden and too painful to really address for all of those years. And it wasn't until I had children of my own, and one day had to drive out in a whiteout blizzard conditions, that I finally had the imagery and the metaphor to write about the death of my mother. And so again, this is in 4 parts, and in part 2, all of the moths that I list are white, And then in the third section, all of the places that I mentioned are the 4 coldest places on Earth. Blizzard. It must have been somewhere outside. Papa sharpening knives by the sink with his coat on, Mama eyeing supper in the pressure cooker as if it could get away from her. Tests, she said, the word hard against the whisting of steel and steam. No one heard the heifer stamping circles of hunger in the snow, her blood turning white against her, his paws at the edge of what he would not be able to bear. Tests, she said again, as the creamed chicken hit the ceiling. They are running some, our eyes all over the wall, not believing anything could go so wrong. Everything will be all right, she murmured, as the radio announced it would be a bad one. Mama, they're dying, a white flurry of them, one by one, a fury so alive I have to watch. Milkweed, Isabella, coddling moths. I know, she said, some things love the light too much. White cutworm, tiny nymph underwing, cottonwood dagger, acrea moths. I have been driving for days with these groceries, paleness of milk-fed chicken, tender implosions of cauliflower, this singular eggplant beating beside me, bruise of my heart swelling crazily inside my ribs. Can you hear me? The voice says. But there is the matter of this driven silence, the white flanneled madness of a child too long in the womb. I strain toward the light. Siberia, Novaya, Ovaya, Shagaluk. The storm presses in, a soft shoe descending. Inside, a gray foot blanches to the bone. There are too many molecules in hope. I hesitate at the pain, but the skin of wind has lost it all. I turn then and almost see a shadow lifting the edge of light and shaking it. Okay, a little lighter-hearted poem here. I seem to have lived 4 separate lives in that different stages of my life. I did something totally different and lived someplace totally different than where I am now. And one such time, I worked for a number of years on a truck farm at the foot of the Rockies in Fort Collins, Colorado, and was a farmhand, which I loved. It was one of the happiest experiences of my life. And I did a lot of driving of heavy equipment, and one of which, those of you who have a rural background may know what a manure spreader is. They were rather wild creatures with, you would get them loaded up and then they would fling the stuff violently over the fields when you pulled them. And this one was actually a whole truck unit that had a bed that we would load up manure from a neighboring dairy, and then it was my job with this thing with triple axles to drive it over the acreage back and forth, flinging this stuff. And usually I did this early morning. And another reference that you might need to know is that the Catholics have a morning prayer called morning offering. And there are a couple of lines from that prayer in here. And then also, if you don't know your cows, Holsteins are the black and white dairy cows, which are referenced here as well. Morning offering. Hauling manure at sunrise, is it God or Lon Chaney who lurks west of the corrals? Everything bites into itself in the early fog. Triple axles thrill into overdrive and slide me through a dream of gears in perfect motion. The suicide knob spins recklessly outside my palm. As I pass the hives on the Redmond hillside, I feel their thrum, the slow work of pulling dark to light. A secret love of the forbidden blushes my soul with brilliant madness. Dave Hanna's beats are leaving home, their scarlet hearts kissing the dirt once more in the rosy glow. I mindlessly pray, O Jesus, through the Immaculate Heart I offer you the morning newsprint of Holsteins and magpies, the conventions of geese and corn stubble, Johansson's dairy resurrected in the milky haze, my works, joys, sufferings. Oh, I cannot stop. This day I will drive, tongue to teeth through steam and pasture, and the prayer that spits from each wheel and scrambles my words, a million little ohms blessing the ground that I cover. In the same way that I read the Dorothea Lange poem before that was written from the point of view of the person in the photograph, I often do that with artworks, which is called Prastic Poetry. And then also in the case of this one, I like writing from the persona of a different person. And this particular piece stems from a little news blurb that I read in the Salina Journal, and it's been a number of years ago. I used to do a lot of fishing, and this stems from a fisherman who basically, as he said, walked into a dead body that was on the bank of the river north of Salina. And there are a few references in here, if you aren't a fisherman and have not ever cleaned a fish, that there is an air sac in a fish that when you clean it, when it's punctured, it gives this little sigh. So that's where that reference comes from. Also, a stone cat is a type of catfish, and catfish feed on the bottom of the water. And so that terminology is used. But this is written from the point of view of the fisherman who found the body as he works through that. It's called Cleaning the Stone Cat. And it begins with the entry from the Salina Journal. Fisherman finds man's body at river's edge. I just walked into him on the bank, he said. So many bones to clean, I should have just left it behind, that fish, but no. It was something about the slitting behind the gills to see air capsize like lament and final breath unstring itself through shivering grass, which kept me until suddenly the light was gone and I stumbled into him, a body on the bank. The way one wakes in the center of a dream too late to turn and go back to the minute when sleep gives way and the mouth opens for some true prayer. Now these evenings settle in like bottom feeders, sinking as I erase whole days to see other than absence cast in the arc of escape, that man's ribs cradling the night's sudden wind. In the distant hills, a coyote laps the silence for the very bone of its cry. A nighthawk hooks the air with its precisely honed dive. I lie awake till the light breaks in, scaling my own skin through the maples. I turn toward my woman, underbelly of her breath holding me buoyant until I reach to touch. Then everything collapses again, deflated and white as a sigh. Beyond the reach of my arms, the river snags on, then runs with a line, in and out and in and gone, and finally, like a mirage, the rushes bend, a body curves like a crescent, lungs beginning to form like gloves around its heart. As I've mentioned, science and biology and geology and archaeology, they're all things that enter my writing a lot. And this one is called Molecules. It's written in, 3 parts. When I was little and first studied molecules, I just knew I could see them. And I used to think that like when you press your eyes closed and you kind of get that jumping around, that was molecules. And even yet as an adult, sometimes when I'm in the presence of something that seems to emit an almost tangible energy, I kind of pretend that I can see molecules. And so that kind of inspires these. And also the fact that my daughter is very scientific, and I don't think there's any references in here, except maybe one. It dates me that those little diagrams that they used to have, like for waltzes and polkas and everything, they're little box step diagrams that showed you where you moved and put your feet. I reference those in here. Molecules. You can see them, I told my sisters, if you press your eyes tightly enough. So we raised our faces to the sky and squinted into the sun, reeling together out there on the gravel as they came to focus just under our lids, flickering towards sight, like spirea blossoms detonating with 1,000 eyes. I imagine them coupling, the word itself like a samba on the tongue, like the 1,002,000 angels Sister Salome enumerated dancing on the head of a pin, such unrestraint gathered in their skins of light that God himself stepped in to order such disorder, to beat those frantic reels of particulate abandon into metrical waltzes, 1, 2, 3, ver, countable box step diagrams. When I ask her, my daughter of science calls them a coalescence, particles oppositely charged and become greater than the sum of their parts. So I recall the moment when she, so tiny, held a bubble aloft on a wand and said, "You know it is there because you can see right through it." And I do look through it, this membrane between us so thin that breath poses danger equal to bone. Everywhere in the falling dark, they push toward belief like newborn stars, racing toward sight light years away. Maverick until focus saddles them with form, some are closer to shape than others. Perfume ambushed inside an elevator, crickets ratcheting in brush, stringer of bluegill thrashing inside a pail. They clamor for recognition. If I could rewind so very slowly to that first premonition of light, pause at the threshold with one foot raised, the shadow of the other falling, barely there, just beyond the haze, molecules, I'd see them hovering like fever, almost visible, almost us. This one, I speak of the bones in our body in a very similar fashion as to the molecules, and it stems from a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who died. But we one time had a conversation where we had our hands extended before us and were marveling at the fact that even though they hold us up through all of our lives, we never get to see our bones, or at least we hope we never get to see them in the form that we could. And so after he died and was cremated, I realized that I was, in essence, seeing his. And if none of you have seen the ashes after cremation, there are still little crystalline particles that don't turn to ash that look kind of like asterisks, and that's referenced in here. Bones. Within our lives, I said, we will never be able to see them. That inability, a confinement, held by an architecture all its own. The cage of days opened slowly, our hands sometimes unhinging before us to examine the shadows we imagined channeling through our bodies like the fingering of bones. Now I hold yours, reduced to ashes in my palm, their crystal asterisks, illusory reference to all we could never touch. Even as I try to flesh them there with my pulse, They only lie, breathless as lace, on the open mantle of my skin. Okay, the last poem I'm going to read is, I suppose anyone who writes has a few pieces that they deem their favorite, and sometimes it's really hard to know why something that you produce pleases you to the point that you know you'll never change it. Almost anything that I've read tonight, I would be open to change. But this particular poem, from the moment I wrote it, has been dear to me, and I've even fashioned a whole installation artwork on its lines. And I think maybe the reason it works is that in essence it states my own feeling about language and writing and the placement of words and how meaning builds and accrues. As I said, I oftentimes reference things like geology. And so stones and how they come into existence figures into this. And there's some mention of particular stones in this. It's called The Habit of Stones. It is the habit of stones to find their way into our hands. These expenditures of rain, worn smooth as words, held too long in the heart. There is a hardness that settles in beyond recall, sometimes when the sky is an ocean's blue and desire presses in with its salt and swell. Surely it was the sea Demosthenes tried to know those days he stood there, shelves of bone and shell coalescing to stones he could not say. Now we hold their names, tongues tracing the tilt of the waves, sounds like breccia splintering in silt over and again, quartz and hornstone and calcite and flint. There is no reckoning with the requisite pain. We close our eyes and close our palms, and the stones bed in, deep as the pit, in the beautiful bruise of the plum. Thank you.